Hi, I'm Bill Singleton, and today I'm going to talk to you about brushes. The brushes I use and some just basic brush tips and brush stroke tips. So think of this as sort of brush strokes 101. So I'm sort of a brush junkie. I got all kinds of brushes for different purposes, different uses, but really over the years I've kind of narrowed it down to just a few brushes here. I still use all those other brushes I just showed you, but really when it comes down to it, 90% of the time I could just use these brushes here. So flat brush, what I call a crazy brush where the hairs are kind of messed up. I have big ones of these also. Fan brush, a round brush, and let's see, a liner for really fine strokes, and one of these, I forget what they call these, color shapers, which is a plastic tip which you can use to rub paint off if it's still wet. So everything I'm going to tell you works with gouache, watercolor, casein, acrylic, basically any water-based paint. These all work. So just show you some of these here to get some paint out. So this flat brush is good for just applying large washes or just water sometimes, especially if you're doing kind of a watercolor technique. This is just water here. One thing you can do with sort of a watercolor technique is start putting some color in there. So you can get large strokes. So good for doing backgrounds or large areas of paint where you need to move quickly. So one of the other brushes for backgrounds too that I use is what I call a crazy brush. It's just get an old brush with really stiff hairs that you can move paint around with, and you can add texture to paint that's still a little wet, or you can come in and do these kind of get a little bit more water on it. You can do sort of expressionistic kind of strokes here. Now, these are wet strokes. So, and that's the different types of strokes too. There's wet. So this is, well, kind of a wet stroke. You can apply just pigment with less water and get a dry stroke. And you can do wet into wet. So we have this over here, so you can see how it holds its shape at this end and then where it bleeds into the water, so you can get different types of effects there. Use the side of your brush to get smaller lines, or the base to get thicker ones. So handy brush to have. If you want to get really fine lines, get one of these liner brushes, and those are good sometimes when I do like say limbs of trees or very fine edges for architectural stuff. This works really good for that. Get very fine lines with this. So handy to have in your toolbox. Fans, don't use too much with this kind of paint, but it's good to, it's more of a blender. If you want to blend colors together sometimes, paints together. Don't use it too much with the water base. I use this more with oil paints, but sometimes it's useful. So fan. And then this is that other tip I was telling you about, that plastic tip where you can sort of, if things are still wet, you can actually kind of think of it as an eraser. I mean, I use it with oils too, and you can move the oil around, but with this, this is acrylic gouache I'm using here. With this you can move it out. Like I said, kind of get some interesting kind of effects here. So Not something I use very often, but it's nice to have in your toolbox also. So really the 90% of the time when I'm using water-based media, I use a round brush. This one here I found, this is my favorite right now. This is an Escoda Perla number 12 round brush. And round brushes are really good. Like I said, this is my favorite. The way to tell, I just dipped this in water, so the way to tell if you have a good round brush, if the hairs are good, is to get it full of water like I just did, and then thump it like that. And if the tip holds its shape, which this does, then you've got a good brush. So this I found, like I said, to be useful most of the time. This is what I mainly use as a round brush. And they're good for several reasons. One is that you can dip it in the paint. The base here is really thick and absorbent, so you can hold a lot of pigment in there. And then you can put some nice bold strokes in there. So you can get a really fat stroke. You can use it this way or from the side. Some nice strokes. Or, since this tip is so fine, you can get really fine strokes. And really, you can, if you hold this correctly, you can get strokes just almost as fine as you could with this liner that I showed you earlier. So one advantage of this to the liner is that you can vary the width of the stroke. So I can, depending on how hard I hold down, I can go from really thin to thick here, all in one motion. So, you know, thick to thin. So this brush is really the most expressive brush of all, and you can get basically calligraphy. You can do hand-lettered calligraphy with this because of the expressiveness of it. For some not doing calligraphy, I do a lot of landscape stuff, so great for leaves, for branches, and you can vary your strokes. You can get little tiny strokes, and you can sort of dab also and get really interesting kind of leaf patterns depending on how hard or soft you hold the brush. So, basic introduction. If you're new to painting, grab a few brushes, especially a round brush if you're working with water media, and just try different strokes. Hold the brush differently, dab it. Apply it gently, apply it firmly. So your sense of touch becomes really important with this, depending on how hard or soft and what angle you hold the brush at determines a lot. And there's really not much I can tell you about that. It's something that you need to learn on your own, and the only way you learn it is by getting a brush and painting. And what I would do is get some blank pages and just make strokes. Just do pages of strokes when you're first starting, of all different shapes. See how much variety you can get, and then look at those strokes and see which ones of those will be useful to you for whatever style of painting you're doing. So like I said, this is the brush I use most of the time. In fact, I can do an entire painting with this brush alone. If I go out in the field sometime and I don't want to carry a bunch of things around, just carry this one brush. That's all I need, which is a Escoda round. So that's basically all you need to know for the basic tutorial on brushstrokes. So get some brushes and some paint and some good absorbent paper. This is mixed media paper, and have fun. Thanks. See you next time.